So I haven't talked about this game in a long time. I just saw a notification on that bell thing on YouTube, and when I looked at what it was, I was like, okay, halt the presses. Because this was in fact a comment on my second video on Marble Arena 2. And if you want to see the full conversation, stick around. Basically, it's a relatively obscure 3D move and jump platform marble game with a lot of cool levels and actually quite advanced graphics options. What's continued to fascinate me is that it has a built-in level creator, where you could easily create these cubic voxel-style shapes, sort of like Minecraft. But then you can also slope units to make them angled, change the scale of the units in what's called grid power, allowing you to work on varying scales. In my old videos, I was talking about how obscure some of the features were, and how I found it difficult to even figure some of these things out. And as it happens, this comment was talking about one of those. Specifically, part of what it was talking about is one of them. Even more specifically, I mean, you can see what it's saying. I assume that meant what this game refers to as entities, which have like this selection box around it, so you can drag and move them along the plane to one of its sides. As it turns out, the last one that's been selected is the one that's active, or selected, or whatnot you call it. And it seems like using the P key, you can edit that item. Okay. I tried this. It opened a properties window for that item. I've never seen this before. I mean, I guess it makes sense, because if you do that with part of a surface selected, you get all these settings for scaling, offset, scrolling animation, rotation, even RGB color multiplication. So this entity here is called the player start position, and you can see it has one value attached to it called orientation. I'm guessing that means the direction the game's camera will face when you open that level. So let's go over and check out some other stuff. I'll just put an ultra speed here, hit E, collect it, and that's going to increase the camera speed moving around in edit mode, making all this go a bit faster. So now for this power up here. Apparently you can see there's actually options to have it give you points. In fact, as many as 10. Many of the game's levels have you collecting stars, which I once thought were the only thing to give you points. White, green, blue, and red, the red giving you 4 points. That does sort of explain this thing I was confused about with this video, where I was testing a bunch of level files from another game called Cuap 2, which does use the same engine to save and load levels. As for the result of that, sometimes it crashed, but others it got very interesting results. Basic geometry is exactly the same because they share the engine, but all of the textures and entities are mangled, because textures from Cuap 2's library that make actual sense there might be a random texture in Marble Arena. Even besides that, you can also make this item give you properties of other power-ups, even though they aren't associated with the one that you initially added the item as. And if you change those sliders, it doesn't change the model attached whatsoever. The other thing is this respawn interval slider, which it seems like it respawns the item every this amount of seconds based on what this is set at. And going by this default of 0, that obviously explains why it never respawns by default. If I could have known about this, I might have used it. Now, let's check out this sound source up here. You can actually change what sound plays through it right here. So you actually don't have to delete it, you can just skim through it and preview the effects of it while editing. And the same for these range options. I mean, I don't care about it nearly as much now. There's far better resources for things like game mechanics, with far more guidance available, because it's not just some color palette marble game. It will have been some influence in my interest and knowledge, and it remains interesting and memorable. But the fact that I wasn't aware of this, and if I was, then I could have made these items behave more like how I want them, by now it's something to be like, oh wow. I mean, I'm really amazed this has been there, that close for all of this time. It's sort of like frustrating and relief simultaneously. So anyways, now let's check out this checkpoint. Well, it's just orientation. Just like the player start. This start, same thing, these options persist across all stars or power-ups that you can add in this game. The start line. This apparently has width, height, and orientation. I don't get what orientation does here though. Maybe it functions like a player starting point? Next one, I'll check out this wind source. Well, it has these options for each axis to change what direction it goes in. Range and strength. Which I assume strength is just a multiplying effect on all 3 values, like it's scaling the vector. So in hindsight, I forgot to check this, but the jump pad has options for the force direction, strength, range, and orientation. You can even set the range to 0, making it look like this. and also not do anything. I'm getting deja vu from this.
Looks like a jump pad? Doesn't look like a jump pad. Contradictory statements. It apparently says it's a jump pad, doesn't do what a jump pad does. Normally it would bounce the marble.
Well, I guess that explains this. It was supposed to be something entirely else in Q2, and one of its properties was set to 0, and it takes the place of the range value. Interesting. Let's add a zapper mine. Properties we get radius, strength, and zap interval. Probably means how often it can zap the marble. Next item, the vortex. Range, height. What is height doing? Let's get a better look at this. Oh, it's just scaling it from the origin. I assume pull is for the force it pulls up inward towards the middle, and then the push value is for the top part that pushes the player up outward. I'll try slingshot next. Why can't I open? Well, I guess it doesn't have any menu. What this thing is for is you roll into it, and there's a power meter that goes up and down, so you time it, and it will launch in the direction you're pointing. Maybe it should have at least given you a strength value. Let's add a material item. Well, this looks similar to Powerups and stars, except you change which material it is, so it can only be one, which is very strange considering how the Powerups work. And again, there's time and respawn time, which it seems like it works the same way. Self-explanatory. So here's another main thing I'm now wondering about.
Gravity bubbles. Firstly, they seem way larger in the main levels than they are in custom levels, and yet there's no apparent way to scale them. Also, the gravity direction is fixed sideways. You cannot change it to upside down or another sideways direction.
Obviously, it seems like this is probably the answer to my confusion over these gravity bubbles. So let's see, there's orientation, like player start, radius, gravity strength, which you can also change in the level settings, then there are 6 possible direction settings, and by default it's set to positive X. In case you're not familiar, X is right, Y is up, and Z is forward, at least in some configurations. So positive X is sideways, explaining why it's fixed sideways. Anyways, you can also add one of these 3D models the game has. So I'll try out this tree. Apparently you can change the rotation, scale, and you can also choose a different model. Instead of having to re-add it and then change those settings again, you can also add in other marbles, which the player can interact with in levels. And like the rest of these things, you can change the same properties as the menu has, without adding the darn thing again. So moving on to this next tab called Audio/Visual Effects. First there's a bunch of particle effects here, and I never cared for any of them really, but it seems like some of them are basic presets, whereas actually there's only a few distinct types of particle spawners, like points, planes, etc. And depending on which one that is, the properties will look different. It's also worth noting, you can add a smoke effect and combine it with a wind source, as well as a vent model, and it seems like they use that technique quite often for levels. You can also add in lights, but first of all, it's not super realistic, it's kind of dated. And also, it doesn't do anything to its surroundings unless you calculate the lighting. And then it makes the entire level look darker, because lighting is turned off by default, which is kind of bizarre. There are a bunch of light options that you can add in different colors. What differs between them though is the red, green, and blue color channels, which the properties menu allows you to fine-tune to get an exact color you want. Finally, you have teleports, destinations, and switches. You can see in the log thing down here, if you change any of these destination settings, it will change to teledest, short form for teleport destination. And then the angle has the exact same purpose as orientation, again for the start and checkpoint. The switch is for toggling if certain teleports are enabled. So like before, you set the index to the same value as the one for the teleport that you want to disable, just like matching it between teleports and destinations. Now one last thing I forgot to check has to do with hints. So I had to open the game again, which I hate doing these days because it turns out the launch window tries to connect to the game's website, which not only does it not work, but that domain name was overridden by a redirect that leads to these sort of random results. I can disable Wi-Fi, but either way it's kind of a headache. Anyways, I talked about how I couldn't figure out adding any text to hints.
There's also a new hint option. However, once you collect the hint, the menu displays a placeholder. and there's no way to type in a message.
Of course now, I once again have a very strong suspicion that this is going to solve that mystery. Indeed, this was how, all along. I don't know why there's a hint ID though. I guess maybe if it's the same it will reuse text associated with other hints with the same ID? I don't get it. You can just copy and paste, right? If they expect you to be able to copy an area of the cube map, like this limits the amount of hints you can have to whatever the slider range is. I also found this option in the Tools window under the Entity Tools tab called Entity Properties. So my first reaction was to wonder what my IQ is, but then I found out if you select any part of the cubic geometry, which is like 90% of the process of using this in the first place, then you can't see the option, which is obviously obscure. Then there's a bunch of these options that have KP at the beginning. I assume that means numeric keypad, which I don't have. I don't think I ever had that for this. There's also environment maps, which I think might be for capturing the environment around them and using it to approximate reflections on things around it, which is how they made these levels actually look good, at least somewhat. Now there's been stuff like that in 3D for a while, especially in real-time games, but usually they're called reflection probes. It's also called reflection mapping here at Wikipedia, so it's not like true accurate reflections, it's just made to suffice. By the way, here's an update on the game's replay recording feature from my conversation. So all of these things are very obscure, and to me it's very strange that such a game as this, with its strange corny carnival style textures and music, would actually be this advanced and this interesting. But again, it does seem to originate from this cube map modeling engine that was used by a few older games. It was just reskinned by different developers. The basic shaping tools like selecting and scrolling are, I guess, relatively simple to use, and it seems like it might actually be helpful to have that option to use something like that in more advanced 3D applications like game engines, because you don't have to worry about any sort of underlying geometry or topological anything, especially for like a prototype. The rest of it though, it really seems like it's mostly targeted towards developers that made these games, or maybe there used to be better manuals in the game's now defunct website. Maybe it's in Wayback. Actually, I'll check that out. I actually tried 2008, and it turns out that not only is it archived, it used to be used for Marble Arena 1. I remember there might have been a different site for this where you could download that, which I actually still was able to do from the archive amazingly enough. I did try to play that game a while back, and I couldn't really do that properly, but I tried to copy the levels inside to where Marble Arena 2 saves them in a user library, and they showed up in the custom tab in the game's menu, and I could even edit them. I also checked out the music, the images, I've tried swapping them out, modifying them, etc. Anyways, that was how it looked until 2011, but then 2012, they started using it for this game, which built on that first one. You could also share custom level maps, which again, they archived many of these for download, so that's all kind of intriguing. But getting back from that tangent, a lot about any advanced applications do require you to have some knowledge about how to do things. Marble Arena is not alone, and much of it comes with the territory. The difference really is the amount of documentation, tutorial videos, and the like available. Well, that's about where I'll end this for now, and I actually do have even more on this, so in the future, maybe I'll do one more of these. Regardless, if you did think that was interesting, YouTube's algorithm deserves to know, and in case you want to see the rest of what I know about this game, I once again already have a couple of videos talking about it. And if you got this far, thanks for watching.